Welcome to KHP 240 Nutrition and Physical Fitness. This serves as an overview for two sets of lecture notes for this week. That is April 7th. The first is for Chapter 12 on endurance athletes, and the second set of lecture notes has no chapter assignment. It's simply notes that I've posted in a PowerPoint format, and that is for training for endurance athletes. So to begin, the overview for Chapter 12 on endurance athletes. The chapter discusses some basic definitions of muscle endurance and cardiovascular endurance. Muscular endurance is basically defined as the ability to contract a muscle repeatedly without undue fatigue or a decrease in performance. Whereas cardiovascular endurance has more to do with the body's efficiency and ability to deliver oxygen to working muscles to provide or produce energy. Chapter 12 then goes into a discussion of the caloric and nutritional requirements for endurance athletes. Specifically, we have some recommendations that endurance athletes should consume 1 gram of carbohydrate per minute of exercise. I think that's practical and people can relate to it very easily to try and meet that recommendation. It talks about sports drinks and the composition of carbohydrates that it should have. You don't want to have too much because that could increase the risk of gastric indigestion. And then it goes into some further daily recommendations of carbohydrate intake. Specifically, endurance athletes should consume about 5 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight per day. So a 70-kilo athlete should be consuming on the upper end of that would be 700 grams, and if you equate that to a caloric value, you can multiply that by 4 kcals per gram, and that's about 2,800 calories per day coming from just carbohydrates. But again, endurance athletes need to consume a lot of carbohydrates given that it's their primary fuel source for exercise. The chapter then talks about the relationship of glycogen stores versus perceived fatigue, and I'd like you to look at that closely and understand that relationship. And then the chapter also kind of finishes up talking about vitamin and mineral needs as well as protein intake during, but especially after endurance exercise. So that kind of completes the overview for Chapter 12 on endurance athletes. I'd like to talk briefly about the second set of notes that are posted on Blackboard, and that is training for endurance sports. The lecture notes begin with a description of several training principles, including the overload and the specificity principles. I want you to be familiar with those. The notes then go into a discussion of the components of an exercise session. What are common components of those? And what's the purpose of those? Those are important points to understand. There are some important definitions regarding endurance performance outcomes that you should be familiar with, and those are maximal aerobic power, or max, or VO2 max. There are a number of different terms for that, as well as the lactate or anaerobic threshold. Both of those are critical outcome measures for endurance athletes, and the training is focused on improving one or each of those. So that transitions us nicely into the next set of notes on the different types of training and how those are used to improve both aerobic capacity as well as the lactate threshold. There's a brief discussion of interval training, long, slow distance training, and high-intensity continuous exercise. I want you to understand the benefits of each of those types of training. Finally, the notes conclude with a description of different types of physiological adaptations that occur due to endurance training, and specifically those adaptations are broken into two general categories, and those are central and peripheral adaptations. Central refer more to cardiorespiratory adaptations that occur, whereas peripheral refers to adaptations occurring within the skeletal muscle that is contracting. That concludes the overview for Chapter 12 on endurance athletes and the additional set of slides that I posted on training for endurance sports.